Hello, and welcome to a new dimension in civil-military relations, military-civilian government, and private sector in cyberspace. Part of the SAIS Merrill Center and Duke Program in American Grand Strategies Conference on Civil-Military Relations, supported by the American in World Consortium. My name is Jenny Arnold, and I will be moderating tonight's discussion. I'm a national security professional and visiting fellow at Duke University in the Sanford School of Public Policy's Counterterrorism and Public Policy Fellowship Program. I'm joined tonight by two distinguished speakers. Dr. David Burbach teaches the politics of US foreign policy, space security, and international relations at the US Naval War College. And Marc Losito, a career military warrant officer in the United States Army and a graduate student at the Sanford School of Public Policy, where he is a Carlucci Fellow in Security Studies. I will moderate a conversation with our speakers for about 30 minutes. Then we will turn over to our virtual attendees for their questions. You may submit a question through the Zoom question and answer chat function. And please be sure to submit your name, title, and affiliation with your question. Please also indicate if you're a student. We'd like to prioritize the student questions. Please also keep in mind that the conference sessions, including the question and answer portions, are on the record and are recorded. So let's get started. With the emergence of cyberspace as a new battleground for the military, many people are concerned about how to balance threats to national security with the appropriate level of civilian oversight. Furthermore, as the civil-military relationship seems to be strained, the question becomes, what can we do to repair and strengthen the relationship and work closer together? And finally, with the emergence of technology, threats such as artificial intelligence, what actions does the US government need to take now to address emerging technology threats? I'd like to turn it over to both the panelists to provide opening comments. Dr. Burbach, you please.
Great. Thank you very much, Jenny, and thank you very much to the America in the World program for the invitation. Let me start off by saying I do teach for the U.S. Navy, but my remarks here are strictly personal views. I'm not representing anybody officially. What cyber means for civil-military relations is a difficult problem, and to go back to a classic in America, many people like to point to the Sam Huntington model, where the military operates in a pretty separate sphere. War is a very distinct activity, separate from most civilian operations. A very overt, literally, if you think about the emphasis we put on military personnel being in uniform and visible, a very overt sort of thing. Cyber conflict is likely to be very different. It's likely to be much more entwined with the civilian economy and civilian activities. Be much more interagency in how we're going to have to coordinate between the military and the rest of government and the rest of society, and be a much more secretive and covert sort of thing. It also differs in that we've become very used to conflict in recent decades for the U.S. as an away game, if you will, something that happens over there, overseas, whereas cyber is going to involve our own economy, domestic effects, and technologically, much of what we've been doing in the last few decades, military technology has been relatively distinct. Especially with nuclear weapons, but even yes, there are commercial airliners, but the sort of supersonic fighter jets that we use are very distinct. Submarines. Whereas now we're dealing with a world where the real technological expertise is in the private sector, as opposed to either in the military or contractors who are very closely tied to military and government. So in many ways, we're going to a world where conflict is going to be more like espionage or sabotage than the kind of open fighting that we're used to. And much more, as we think about the role of say, disinformation, much more closely connected to politics, to messaging, not simply to, blowing something up somewhere. And that inherently kind of starts to infringe on, civil liberties or, how we communicate politically. So there are a number of things we're going to have to figure out. And one concern that I have is because as has been discussed in previous panels, the very high trust of the American public in in the American military means that it's very easy for us to say, well, let the military handle this, whatever this is. And I think that would especially be a mistake in the cyber realm because it's so different than what we expect the military to do, where in some ways some of their competencies are, that it would be wrong to figure, well, it's got the word conflict in it, so surely we must, want to put the military in the lead. It's going to have to be, more whole, it's an easy phrase to toss out, but whole of government, interagency, and kind of getting away from that Huntingtonian model of conflict is this very distinct, separate sphere that you can handle to professionals in uniform who know how to handle it. Is going to be more political. We're also going to have to figure out, one particular problem is how much we want to emphasize offense versus defense. We have been the world leader in cyber attacks. We are amazing at what we're able to do with espionage and cyber surveillance. We'll have to figure out as we start to worry about attacks on the U.S. Are we willing to make trade-offs that might compromise some of our ability to exploit cyber? And, just given the political environment we're in, so long as part of cyber kind of gets into the realm of disinformation, misinformation, political warfare, so long as there are, political figures in the United States who are willing to make use of foreign disinformation and foreign attacks, foreign cyber attacks, the military can't solve the problem of American politicians being willing to make use and exploit foreign cyber attacks against the United States. That's really a much larger political issue. So lots of stuff to talk about. I look forward to our conversation.
Great, thank you. Mr. Losito?
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. As Jenny mentioned, I'm Marc Losito. I'm a first-year MPP candidate at the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke University. And really where my interests lie are at the intersection of national security and technology. So I'm happy to be on this panel talking about civil-military relations in the cyber domain. I know we're going to talk about a couple of things, but there are a couple of topics, but there are a couple that stand out to me as the cyber domain is this intricately intertwined and interrelated space of civilian private infrastructure, but also military capacity and capability, where the attack surface is increasingly the civilian population and our civilian infrastructure. And as Dr. Burbach had mentioned, there is an easy button that has developed in the last 20, 30, 40 years of the military handling these sort of away game problems. And I think that, we're going to have to revise our lexicon. We're going to have to revise the way that we envisage civil military relations in this domain, using phrases. I'm sure we'll talk about this, but a digital Pearl Harbor connotes a military response to an attack, and we've got to revise sort of that level of usage. And I think that there's in the military specifically, there needs to be a gravitational force that pulls us closer together, but allows us to ask those hard questions about why we're doing what we're doing, who's given us the authority to do it, what conditions have been met, and under what circumstances we can execute, cyber tools and warfare in the cyber domain and still be responsible to our elected officials. So I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to talk about this. And Jenny, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, so you both touched on the policy portion of this. So my first question for you both is, in an era of persistent cyber conflict, how can the United States respond to cyber attacks in a manner that ensures sufficient civilian oversight to safeguard civil liberties? Dr. Burbach, would you like to take that first?
Sure, I'll give that a shot. It's, up until now, we actually have had, it has not been easy, actually, for the military to launch, retaliatory cyber attacks. We've actually kept the authority to use what we call offensive cyber attacks at a pretty high level. In fact, until recently, even White House level approval, in part because one key difference of cyber from many other technologies is if you launch, whether whether it's a conventional bomb or a nuclear bomb, if you throw one, the rest of your arsenal still works. With cyber, so often, if you choose to use a vulnerability you've identified within the other side, you may be taking away the ability to ever use that again. They may, since the other side may recognize and use it. So one particular problem that we've had is you need actually a pretty centralized high level control. And we may, I've heard some military cyber people who think we actually have made it too difficult for ourselves to retaliate. And I'm not sure about that, but it's going to be critical, I think, to, we don't want to err on the side of making it too easy, I think, for whether it be the military or the intel community, precisely because, we're going to have to think about what might other countries be able to do in return to our civilian economy. Do we expose, one of the things that we saw happen with the Stuxnet attack is, that revealed vulnerabilities and ways to exploit vulnerabilities that other people could essentially copy the code and use. And there's at a technical level, there are a variety of issues that are just very different than what we're used to. And so I think we're going to need to have, on the one hand, it does make it more cumbersome and bureaucratic, but we're going to have a lot of different interests represented in the rooms making those decisions, so that we think about what might happen to the civilian economy, what trade-offs are there where if we show, an attack technology, in this case, are we losing the ability to use something we might regret and want even more in the future? Are we exposing techniques that can be used against ourselves, where instead of saving something for the attack, maybe we should be calling up, Google or Microsoft and saying, "Oh my God, you got to fix this vulnerability right away." So it's a very different technical world than what we're used to in many respects.
Great, Mr. Losito.
Yeah, I echo all of those comments. I recently wrote a piece where I used this analogy from Milton Friedman about the fool in the shower and this incremental policy change without actually waiting for the temperature to change to see if you've gotten it right. And since September 11th, we've incrementally slid the authorities down the line from the president to the interagency PPD 20 governed process. And then, most recently in the previous administration, we've pushed that authority to execute cyber operations down to the operational commander. And so we've, gradually, increased our operational capability and speed, but at what cost and at what risk? And so that would be my first point. And I think that we need to take a look at, what Bobby Chesney might say is a cyber AUMF or a de facto cyber AUMF in the NDAA 19 that might, get us into a position where we're operating out in front of Congress. But my second point would be to protect ourselves in the cyber domain. Let's get to the left of the attack. And let's talk about what we can do to strengthen our defenses and infrastructure to the left of the attack. And I'd really like to see some legislation or some money set aside for cyber infrastructure in this $2.2 trillion infrastructure bill in Congress right now. And I'd like to see that set aside so that we might be able to provide grants to private industries to get to the, sector specific best practices that are set out by CISA, that allows us to harden our defenses at home while rethinking how we act abroad.
As a follow-up to that, a lot of our critical infrastructure is owned and supported by the private sector, and the need for partnership is critical. What can be done to facilitate better technology sharing between the military and the private sector? Mr. Losito, can you take that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first thing that I would get to is what's already in place. And so our viewers might be familiar with the Defense Innovation Unit and the Defense Innovation Board, that assist in pulling together the private sector and the Department of Defense in emerging technologies, AI, machine learning, but also in cyber as well. And I think that that's, when they look at how the military or how the Pentagon task organizes around emerging technologies, that's extremely helpful. Because what I've found is that there is this mystique or this mystique barrier between new technologies and leaders on the battlefield, and so it really helps break down those barriers and integrate those new technologies into everyday battlefield processes. The last thing I would say on integrating emerging technologies into the Department of Defense is potentially taking another look at our other transactional authority. It's an authority within the Department of Defense to expedite the acquisition of advanced commercial technologies that are advantageous to the Department of Defense. And I'm not talking about weapons and warfare here. I'm talking about eliminating the pain points that our commanders and staffs spend inordinate numbers of hours culling through trapped data, data mining in their own emails to get information to our elected civilian officials that we owe them in a timely manner. We can speed this process up with the aid of commercial technology, and so I'd take a look at the OTA authority and how we can more quickly integrate technology that helps us do that.
Great, thank you. Dr. Burbach.
Sure, I'm sorry. Just to build on that, people sometimes talk about there being a valley of death where the DoD is reasonably good and is getting better at reaching out to early stage technology and learning about it and fostering it. But when you get to the point of trying to scale that up into major procurement systems, the current cumbersome system we have for procurement, not only to procure but also the contract challenge process. I mean, we see right now, Amazon, Microsoft, Oracle, the big Jedi cloud computing contract. That's an unusual case where kind of politics got pulled directly into it. But even when that's not true, I mean, we have seen it take an inordinate amount of time, for example, for the Air Force to make its decision and really move ahead with a contract to buy new tanker aircraft from traditional contractors, because the process of Airbus and Boeing disputing the contract was so drawn out in a field where technology is changing so rapidly. And this is difficult to change because, any member of Congress who feels like their state's contractor lost out is not going to want to change this process. So there's, it's easy to point at the Pentagon and say, you need to do business differently, but we also need to recognize this requires legislative change. And there are real congressional interests behind some of the ways that our system is so slow and difficult. That makes it hard to change, but it's easy for, I think, CEOs to point at the Pentagon and say, why do you make it so hard for us to do business with you? In many cases, the answer is because Congress wants it that way, and we need to raise the profile of that issue, and I think see legislative reform that enables the DoD to move more rapidly with high technology purchases.
So how can the military address talent acquisition and tap into the domain expertise as well as move at the speed of business? Mr. Losito?
Sure. So talent acquisition, and this is, I'll go 2 points fairly quickly. The first is, how do you get new talent in? And there's so highly qualified experts, the HQE route is a method to get new talent in. I don't think that's where we should stop. We should look for additional ways to get new talent in. Doesn't have to be in uniform. It can be in a separate, expert corps. It can be in a separate entity that either is an outshoot or an offgrowth of the Defense Innovation Unit, of highly qualified experts or otherwise. The second is, what do you do and how do you talent manage those highly qualified experts once you have them in? And I think that goes to how you task organize around the technology. And I think you need to start with the end in mind. Right now we have a very 1950, 1960 mindset of where we look at platforms. We look at, if we're talking about the 50s and 60s, we're talking about aircraft carriers and battleships. But, now we need to start looking at the desired ends in mind. We need to start looking at, not the platform, but what is the end and what is the effect? And then we need to task organize around that. And then the last point that I would make is we need to, task organize with the idea that it could and should go away in lieu of something better tomorrow. And so in computer programming, that's called the self-deleting executable. And so if we organize with this self-deleting executable philosophy where we're ready to get rid of this at any point in time when something new comes around, that way we don't get entrenched into some of the same problems that we're facing today with entrenchment.
Dr. Burbach, would you like to take this one? I'm also curious how we incentivize folks to work with the military when you run into things like clearance issues, and how to get folks willing to take less money, things of that nature.
It's difficult. My guess is that if you were to compare how the salaries in say Boeing for an engineer compared to DoD positions in the 1950s, I suspect the comparison between the DoD today and Facebook or Google looks a lot worse for DoD than it did 50 or 60 years ago. In fact, I've read the average salary at Facebook, which is going to include low-level, clerical people, is over $250K a year. I mean, that's more than the Secretary of Defense earns. So I feel uncomfortable as a civil servant saying Congress needs to let civil servants get paid more money. I'm willing to take myself off the list. I'm not a computer security expert, but ultimately you provide the incentives. And I think we have found ways to try and get around the problem. We can do contractors. We need to, I think, accept that the way the economy works right now, it's very difficult for government to provide either enough money or the work environment. I mean, you can appeal to patriotism, but there's a limit to how far that works. I mean, maybe it's all a patriotism change since the 1950s, but I think actual incentives matter here. But we also do, and on the cultural end, I mean, it's easy to say. Well, there was the War on the Rocks blog had a piece by a former colleague of mine, suggesting we need to be okay with people having blue hair in the military. That we need to relax some of the standard. Or is it the case that everybody who's dealing with cyber issues needs to be able to pass the Army PT test? Maybe there are some ways that we can relax. I look at my friends. I was at MIT during the .com boom, and made the choice to go and become a civil servant instead of getting rich somewhere. But I have a lot of IT friends, and yeah, they have a much more sort of flexible environment that as much as they're patriots, it would be pretty hard to convince them to go to Washington D.C. and commute and sit at a desk in the Pentagon every day. So we may need to think. Give up some traditions and be willing to find a way to make it a more pleasant and attractive work environment, given that, the competition is what it is.
Yeah, Ginny, can I add one more thing?
Yep, go ahead.
And dovetailing into what Dr. Burbach just said about culture, I think that the Project Maven from Google is a good use case to talk about transparency and trust. This is a bit of what I would lump into the mystique barrier between the tech world and between the Pentagon. And when I say the Pentagon, I mean the military writ large. There needs to be, and General Shanahan had made this comment in an op-ed piece too, that transparency and trust may have actually prevented this sort of ungluing of Project Maven, just Google it if you're interested in what happened there. But I think that there needs to be a bit of decryption between like what we're trying to do in the military with technology. If you read the National Defense Strategy, it talks a lot about the lethality of the joint force. And when you're talking to a bunch of computer programmers and engineers at Google, and you say things like that, and they're working on computer vision for full motion video, they can make logical leaps to say that you're going to use their product to, use applied violence on the battlefield and, conduct, large amounts of warfare. And I think, just a bit of decryption, just a bit of, language translation to say that, hey, no, lethality of the joint force actually means, putting into, having quicker, faster, and more reliable information on the battlefield than your enemy so that you can impart deterrence, so that you don't have to use applied violence. And I think that there's a bit of transparency and trust in what you're doing. And there's also a lexicon issue.
Great. So shifting to the mistrust of the military and civilian relationship, what can we do to strengthen and rebuild that trust? Dr. Burbach?
Sure. In some ways, given the really high confidence and trust that we see generally in society, this may seem like it's not too much of a problem, but as in the Google case that Marc just described, I think there are clearly some trust issues in very specific sectors. And if you break down the general figures on confidence and trust, highly educated Americans who are politically liberal are less likely to be, have high trust in the military. My guess is, and likewise, women are less likely to be as trusting as men, non-whites. If as we talk about a more diverse, highly educated workforce, it's that I suspect that we find in Silicon Valley, it's not surprising that culturally they may be, and I don't want my comments here to be those liberal professors are brainwashing their students to hate the military, because I don't think it's that. But there I think is something of a cultural gap where we know that students at a lot of universities are not exposed to most of them will not have served in the military. ROTC presence may or may not be a big thing. And I think as Marc laid out, the DoD can often make things sound worse than they are. I mean, at the end of the day, we are talking about warfare, but when we use lethality as kind of the very lead word, or I recently read an article talking about from the JAG, the military lawyer community, that characterized human rights groups as external threats. Now, they meant that in the sense of like they're writing op-eds to members of Congress and we have to counter those arguments. External threats was a way to phrase it that I kind of read that thinking, I guess I'm an internal threat because I work for DoD, but I disagree with some of this. So I think we on the DoD side could do a lot better at learning how to speak other communities' languages and not expecting them to learn how to speak ours. Partly it's, probably finding some of the right companies to work with. I mean, the Google case, got a lot of attention, but Palantir, is very happy to work with. And there are a lot of companies that are very happy, to some extent, the Google case probably, that probably made the problem sound worse than I suspect it is industry wide. But I think there is some that the military needs to do some reaching out, not simply at the CEO to SecDef level, but in general at kind of reducing some of the gap about understanding what the military is up to. That said, there is a degree of if we have kind of the young, highly professional elite generations really not buying into U.S. foreign policy writ large, that's going to be, I don't know if the military can solve that gap on its own. I mean, that becomes at some point a larger political problem that probably you can't solve just through public relations, though I think we can do better on the public relations side too.
Great, thank you. Mr. Losito, I might know that you're working on artificial intelligence in your research, so this question is for you. How does the emergence of artificial intelligence shape the way the military looks at cyberspace?
Yeah, that is, it's a good question because I don't know that the two are exactly interchangeable, but I do know that there are some transferable skills that the military can apply to each one of those. And I think I'll put them in two buckets. The first is, how do we think, acquire, and employ emerging technology, whether it's AI, machine learning, or it's, tools in cyberspace. And I think, it's not altogether different when we think about the other systems that we, envisage the requirement, we execute an acquisition that takes multiple years, and then we employ this system or this program of record that potentially doesn't exactly serve the requirement, or the requirement has changed since we've deployed this, since we levied the requirement. So I think there's one thing that we need to think about is that AI, machine learning, and cyberspace are going to have to change that paradigm. We've got to flip it on its head, because we're going to be fighting off old code rather than fighting off bad code. I'd rather, in the AI world, I'd rather fight off bad code than fight off old code, because I can do that rapidly, I can do it iteratively, and I can do it, near real time. If I'm fighting off old code, that means I have to live with it for about a year at a time until, I get this huge update to our system. And so I apply that to the cyber domain as well. In cyber, we have to think about how we interact with our civilian counterparts. Are we going to do that in 3 to 5 year terms on a POM cycle, or are we going to do that in an iterative, daily, shoulder to shoulder, sort of formation with our civilian counterparts in cyberspace? The second thing that I would say is that we've got to think about, these barriers to employing our tools in cyberspace and AI and machine learning. And the main barrier that I'll put up here, and I think there are 4, and very quickly, I think that the 4 barriers that are going to, hold us back from actually being effective here in the DoD. The commercial sector will push past these barriers, but the first is bureaucracy. The second is democratization. The third is integration. And the fourth is, oh shoot, I lost it. I'll come back to it. But democratization is the most important one, right? Making sure that the cyber concepts, the cyber tools, the cyber education, the domain expertise gets pushed down to the warfighter, and it doesn't stay in the halls of the Pentagon, because wars are not fought from the halls of the Pentagon. They're fought, on the battlefield. And we've got to democratize these tools down to the operational and even sometimes the tactical level.
Great, thank you. We're now going to open up the conversation to questions from the virtual attendees. Please remember to ask a question, you use the Zoom Q&A chat function. Be sure to submit your name, title, and affiliation with your question and indicate whether or not you're a student. All conference sessions are on the record. I'd like to start with Ashil Javeri, a Duke undergraduate, is asking, could you talk a little bit about the government sharing versus hoarding zero-day exploits and the relative advantages of each? How does this fit into the larger discussion about whether to prioritize defensive versus offensive capabilities? Dr. Burbach, would you like to take that?
Sure. I'll do what I can there. Marc may be able to say a little more about some of the technical implications, but zero-day exploits, for anyone who's not familiar with that term, are vulnerabilities in software that have not been patched, have not been fixed yet, and so everybody out there who's running it is open to it. And we know from what we understand that the U.S. government, and other governments collect these, and we use them for espionage, potentially for offensive cyber operations. For anyone that we find, we in theory could call up the software manufacturer, tell them about it, and have them send out a patch. So every time we find one of these opportunities for cyber offense, we could also choose to play it in a defensive way. And like I said in the beginning, when we talk about foreign governments who have done some kind of hack against us, we often sound, oh my God, that's so immoral and wrong. We're really good at doing this. I mean, there was a moment of candor when I forget. I think it was I forget if it was Brennan or Clapper in the previous administration who said, with respect to the Chinese hacking into federal employee security clearance databases, that boy, if we'd been able to do that to them, I'd do that in a heartbeat. Of course, I would have stolen all the data on their employees, and you almost have to give them some professional credit for that. I mean, it was a slightly impolitic way to phrase it. With the Solar Winds hack as well recently, that appears to have exposed a bunch of vulnerabilities. I mean, all the reports are that we have done things like that too. So we face a little bit of a choice of, if we want to be the kind of superpower of cyber defense, we probably need to be less good at espionage and offense than we have been. And there are things that we absolutely gain in this country. Our national security is better because we know what foreign governments are up to. Because we can find where terrorists are. We have chosen to err on the side of keeping those capabilities while not being oblivious to defense. And I don't want to punt kind of the hard, do we have the balance right to Marc, but it's a very real trade-off. And I know, I'm not, I think industry might be happier if the U.S. government leaned more on the defensive side, like, hey, let us know about these rather than hanging on to them and choosing to exploit them. But as other countries are catching up, it's probably becoming, the cost of protecting offensive capabilities is probably growing as more other countries are able to, to catch up and quickly find some of these vulnerabilities too.
That was exactly the point that I was going to make is the costs and the risks involved. And Ash, you ask a great question. And, I hate to say that it's a moving target, but it really is. And there's two things. Dr. Burbach covered one, and it's the growing capacity of our competitors in this space. And the second thing that I would consider is the risk. Who is actually at risk here? And it's the civilian population. It's everyday Americans. It's our critical infrastructure. It is our sector infrastructure. It is everything from a water reservoir in Florida to an electric grid in Texas. And I think when you calculate that risk, you might tend towards a little bit more of defense. But this is the ultimate cops and spies question. And I think that, as our competitors catch up in this sphere, we'll tend to lean more towards cops than we will spies.
Great, thank you. Our next question comes from Bobby O'Keefe, a PhD student at the American University and an Air Force colonel. And he asks, considering military-industrial partnership, the defense establishment and private companies have fundamentally different purposes that span a security enterprise spectrum. What are the natural limits to cyber cooperation across this divide to support national security? Dr. Burbach?
Boy, that's a broad and difficult question. Just to kind of push back on the question a little bit, if it's, we are so dependent upon the private sector for cyber. I mean, none of this is being invented and pushed out and developed on the defense side, the way, say it was for nuclear weapons, that if we don't have a good cooperative relationship, we're going to be sunk, especially so long as the IT industry is as globalized as it is. Now, I mean, we could move to, we could go back to the Cold War sort of world. I mean, maybe, and we are seeing kind of, a bit of a closure in the world economy, where we wouldn't sell computers to the Soviets or their allies. I mean, that would be a pretty radical disruption of world trade. But at this point, the the global IT sector is bigger than the U.S. Defense Department. I mean, I think it's partly on us. I mean, this is an uncomfortable place for DoD to be, but there's a degree to which we need to make this work. And if we're the ones that have to do the most uncomfortable adaptation, that may be the case. Now, you could, I suppose, as a matter of U.S. law, kind of really clamp down on the tech industry, force them to cooperate more, and reduce their international operations. I think we probably end up worse off, and we may be to a point where other countries have enough, tech capability of their own. I mean, it was bad enough in a world where the Chinese were able to quickly copy and emulate U.S. innovations. I mean, there's a lot of real basic R&D going on in China right now. So I mean, our ability to, the Russians are somewhat narrower than China, but they're really good at at software, especially really good at finding vulnerabilities and doing hacking. So I mean, there are some limits, but we need this to be a very close partnership. So I realize I didn't quite answer the what are the limits side of that, but I think I would put the emphasis on we need to find a way to make that partnership work as closely as possible.
Yeah, I'd echo that. I think you have to start where the natural mutual middle ground is for cyber cooperation. And I look to the recent and well, not so recent now, but the takedown of TrickBot. And although it may not have been like an institutionally collaborative effort, Cybercom's efforts, along with Microsoft's judicial efforts, that should be a model of how we can institutionalize this cyber cooperation for national security between the public and the private sector. And I think that points out, a glaring fact is that we don't have these institutional mechanisms for repeatable and scalable cooperation for national security. I think that we won't know the natural limits until we actually institutionalize around that mutual middle ground.
So that leads me to the question of, do either of you believe that our current cybersecurity strategy clearly delineates the responsibilities of the military to avoid unsupervised military warfare?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that first. And the first thing I do is divide it into two parts. Does our current national security or national cyber strategy delineate? Yes, it does. So in the 2019 NDAA, the first thing, or one of the most important things that piece of legislation did, was it said that clandestine cyber activities by the military are categorized as traditional military activities. So activities that were previously, and this was a hotly contested issue, which is why it went into legislation, those were reserved for covert action, where you needed a finding and you needed the agency to channel that action for you. So that was the first piece. The second thing that NDA 19 did was set a set of requirements or conditions, the big four, really. If you could attribute a malicious cyber activity to the big four, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, that the military could take what was in the legislation, proportional cyber activity in foreign spaces abroad. And that means outside of conflicts of theaters of war. So you essentially just set a new paradigm for cyber warfare with effects outside of a congressionally delegated theater of war. And so does that get us to a point where we're executing warfare outside of civilian oversight? The answer is, I don't know, because a lot of this is classified. A lot of the cyber warfare is classified, secret. PPD 20, the previous process before the PSP process was put into place. All we know is that you had post facto notification to Congress after you had conducted the activity. And so the first answer is yes, we do delineate. The second answer is I don't know.
Great, thank you. Dr. Burbach, this question is for you. It's from Kayla Savak-Reed from the Department of Defense and a JHU SACE student. Building off of what Dr. Burbank mentioned regarding the need for the military to reach out more to the private sector to enable clearer communication of intent, what methods do the panelists envision that the DoD could use to conduct that outreach? And how could DoD reach out to those companies and scientists in a way that ensures transparency of mission while also adhering to strict oversight requirements of non-bias in private sector contractor relations?
Well, Kayla has sort of hit with the that last last part of her question there has sort of hit on it with one of the big difficulties that we face in contracting is on the one hand we it's very difficult to go talk to industry leaders if you need to be absolutely hands off and not appear to be favoring one company or another. I mean, if a leading private corporation becomes aware of, hey, here's some hot new thing in Silicon Valley, they will go out there, talk to, and they may sign a deal almost on the spot. We have it in DoD and federal government more broadly have a lot of regulations that precisely require very hands off just at a personal pithy example of this, I like using split ergonomic keyboards. It took like 20 pages of paperwork with about 6 or 8 signatures, and they still couldn't give me the brand I wanted because another different brand was a couple of dollars cheaper or something. And I don't get to specify a preferred brand for the keyboard. We kind of work like that at the large level too. So I think we may need some legislative relief, and this does happen. Like NASA, for example, actually through going their founding legislation, NASA can form what are called Space Act agreements that are much quicker, because we saw ourselves in such a race with the Soviets back then, and then into the Apollo era. NASA legislatively has some vehicles for making kind of going to somebody and doing sole source contracts, or hey, we know you're the company that knows how to do this. DoD has some authorities like that. I think we probably need to try to expand them, recognizing you put an unsupervised authority in the hands of a 2 million person bureaucracy, and somebody is going to abuse it and give a contract to their brother-in-law that we probably shouldn't give. And the other side of that is politically, we need to be more accepting of people giving contracts to their brother-in-laws. Not that we want to allow it or encourage it, but if the cost of getting what we need is we have an incremental increase in waste and scandals, it can be worth it. I mean, Google, for example, has made a for employee, kind of at the individual level. They now have made, they now let their individual employees basically put whatever travel expenses they think are appropriate on a company credit card and figure that the money they save trying to administer travel down to the kind of micromanage level isn't worth it. For especially in fast-moving technical fields, we probably need to be more willing to have mistakes happen, for bets to not pay off, and even a few scandals to happen, in order to have the flexibility and freedom to move fast and really form deals where it's worth it. I mean, that's again, that kind of is very much against usual federal civil service ethos. But at some point we tie ourselves up so much avoiding bad things that we're not able to get any good things done either.
Mr. Losito, did you have anything to add?
No, I think Dr. Burbach covered pretty much the whole thing there.
Great. Our next question is from Samuel Croy, a first-year master's candidate at SAIS. He asks, with respect to the strategic considerations of cyber operations, where should the buck stop? Conduct of cyber operations can take place at a tactical military execution level, but even relatively minor espionage cyber intrusions could produce strategic implications and escalations. If every operation has some % chance of strategic escalation, when, where, and how does the United States require civilian leadership oversight for military cyber operations? Mr. Losito, you want to take that one first?
Sure. The easy answer is to go with Truman and say the buck stops here at the president, but that's not always. Cyber is a space where that may not be the most advisable course because the speed at which things happen, the damage and the scale at which things can happen. But there does need to be a legal regime that stems forth from the president, through the secretaries, that clearly lays out what executions can be done and at what level they are coordinated in the interagency. So there must be an interagency coordination process. And I keep going back to PPD 20, but when the previous administration pushed operational authority down below the interagency process, it didn't completely vanquish civilian oversight, but it diminished it. It diminished it to a point where, I think there's risk in that diminishment. And so I do know that it probably needs to be raised up a little bit, but exactly where, I'm not sure.
And I'll say I generally agree with that, and I think that again this is an area where just the very nature of the technology makes it different than nuclear or conventional warfare, where the use of a weapon at a tactical level once might invalidate that weapon for everybody else who might every other possible use of it. So we probably, and this is getting beyond sort of my technical knowledge of how we do this, but distinguishing between tools that we make available that rely on completely undisclosed, unexploited vulnerabilities, because presumably there are, cyber tools that, may not work in every case, but are going to be useful, in many situations. I think we probably don't want to push down, to the level of, an individual, skipper on a ship or battalion commander to use a 0-day exploit against the current version of Windows that almost everybody in the world is going to be vulnerable to. I mean, that's probably not how we want, that decision made. There are other tools that may be, that we may know that, this is just an inherent flaw of a given system, or, we know a lot of people haven't patched against something. So, and this is also, let me just say, I have a security clearance, but I don't think I've ever read a single classified document related to cyber. So, I stay, I like to do public facing work like this, so I stay away from the classified world. But anything at the level of kind of how do we characterize, or what do we have, that gets so classified very quickly that it's hard to have conversations. Where I think we probably need to do more work as well is figuring out how to have conversations about policy related to highly classified areas without actually exposing the technology. Because we've gotten better. 10 years ago, I would often have cyber students in my classes when we were talking about cyber stuff who would say nothing all day and kind of say, well, you guys really don't know what you're talking about, but I can't say anything. That's not helpful to everybody else in the force. And we're getting better about that. But I think we probably need to figure out ways to have conversations about, again, policy about very secret stuff that while still protecting the actual technical details.
Yeah, and Samuel, I'll add one more thing, one more piece of evidence of why we should probably elevate that authority, and that's the lack of norms in cyberspace. And so I think that creates a different element of risk. When you're playing poker at a table where everybody understands the rules of poker and everybody's agreed on those rules, you can make strategic calculations because you understand what the pragmatic players are going to do. But because there's a lack of norms, a lack of international norms in cyberspace, it introduces a bit of strategic risk that I don't think we're prepared or should not be prepared to push down, which would require additional civilian oversight.
Thank you. We've got a question from Charles Stevenson, professor at Johns Hopkins SAIS. We have a legal firewall between DoD for .mil websites and DHS for .gov websites, but a dual-hatted NSA and Cyber Command are both right. Dr. Burbach?
I hate to punt here. Marc may be closer to some of the actual doctrinal legal splits here, so he might be able to take that on more effectively than I can.
So I'll give it my best shot. The real conundrum here is the dual hat between NSA and Cyber Command, and how does I kind of look back at history when the director of the CIA also had the director of Central Intelligence responsibilities. How can any one man be expected to manage both of those responsibilities? Now, I know that's not exactly the question that you're asking, but I do think that it provides a framework of thought for the two hats that are worn at NSA. So I think that the mission management is very clearly delineated between NSA and Cybercom. So I think we can put that issue to bed. I think that in the last conversations about separating NSA and Cybercom, generally the opposition was, is Cybercom organizationally ready to support itself, aside from NSA? And I could be wrong there, but I thought it was more of a .mil TF question than it was a legal issue. But for now, I think we've got a scenario that works until we can broach that topic again. And I think that, at least on the federal side, DHS and DoD understand their roles in protecting the .mil and the .gov domains.
I'll just expand to kind of take that beyond the government side. A question that people ask is, should we have a more direct federal role or even military role in securing private networks? I'm leery of going down that road. I probably would like to see incentives or standards that require more security concern on the part of the private sector, especially as if you've heard the term the Internet of Things, as we start building the internet into all kinds of devices. There are a variety of websites or Twitter accounts you can follow making fun of just how horrible the security is in all kinds of devices. There's no way I'm getting my refrigerator doesn't need to be on the internet. I don't need somebody to hold my stove hostage by for ransomware. But these are things that actually happen. So and at the network level, we have not really forced, in the same way that we do force, say, medical device manufacturers to be, actually, even they don't have to be as cybersecurity conscious as you would like, but they've had to be very conscious about, so the pacemaker doesn't short out after you put it in somebody. I mean, would you want the people who make the websites you often visit to be making pacemakers? Probably not. I don't think that translates to, I want the federal government to be managing security, especially, I really don't think we want to see, say, the military in the business of, policing foreign disinformation on the American internet. I mean, I think that starts getting very troublesome very quickly. I think we probably do, even if it's at the level of just, making, essentially making product liability law, allowing more people to sue for damages with security failures. I toss that out, not because I'm an expert on the subject, but that's the kind of thing I would imagine. But I think we probably do want, for not just, in addition to just, defeating criminals and, bored teenagers, in terms of foreign adversaries, I think we would do well to incentivize a lot more security consciousness on the part of people, manufacturing, making internet products and software.
Yeah, and Professor Stevenson, I wanted to circle back. I lost a little bit of my train of thought there when I was talking about the director of Central Intelligence and the director of the CIA. So if we look at, the Goldwater's-Nichols Act, the five failures that led to that. And then if we look at the Homeland Security Act and September 11th that prompted that, and we look at, the Intel Reform and Terrorist Prevention Act, and, the two failures that, preempted that, I think, it's not okay to wait for those things to happen. But I think that that's what it's going to have to take in order to pry those two commands apart, or rather that agency and that command. So I just wanted to circle back to that.
Great. I think we have time for one more question, and it comes from Judd Crane, a SICE alum. With expertise and capability in our civilian institutions and organizations, should the United States national security community consider incorporating private organizations into the offensive operations in some capacity? Dr. Burbach, would you like to take that real quick?
I'm essentially cyber mercenaries, maybe. I'm a little hesitant there. And in fact, one thing we have seen already are, former U.S. military or intel community personnel going to work for foreign governments or private companies working for foreign governments, kind of taking their talents elsewhere and doing work we probably wouldn't want them to do in the U.S. So, my guess is that some of the contractors who have real expertise probably get incorporated pretty closely. And again, this is going, details are going to be classified enough that I just don't know. My guess is that line is probably a pretty fine line already. I would, for example, probably not want to say issue the cyber equivalent of letters of marque and reprisal to private companies and have them go out and do attacks on their own, or not, at least not on behalf of the U.S. There's talk about should we make it easier for companies to do kind of their own cyber deterrent? I worry that we quickly end up in a world like, well, if everybody had a nuclear bomb, we'd be a more polite society because we'd all threaten to nuke each other all the time. Maybe that works out, maybe that doesn't. So I have not thought that idea through carefully. My gut reaction is to be very, very leery about it.
Yeah, that's also my gut reaction. And, I want to preface this by saying, absent of covert action, I think there's a space for it. And I'd be hesitant, and I don't deal in covert action, so let me just say that. But I think there's a space for it there. But that's neither my expertise nor my area. That's the CIA. But absent of that, I'd be very hesitant to incorporate, civilian companies into the execution of cyber warfare. There may be a space for them to support, develop tools, to develop infrastructure, all of those things. But at the end of the day, it's the Department of Defense who's trained to follow orders and, fight those battles. And it's our civilian leaders who are supposed to be asking those hard questions about why we're fighting those battles in the first place. And I don't think that in that paradigm, there's a space for a CEO to be wedged in the middle.
Great, thank you. I want to thank all of our speakers tonight and our attendees for joining us. This has been a really great discussion. I wish we had more time, but I'd like to now welcome Dr. Paula Thornhill for her closing remarks.
Jenny, thank you, and David and Mark, thank you also. What a terrific panel and what a great note to end on. What I wanted to do for just a few moments, especially for the students who might have stayed with us to the bitter end, is to go through and capture the big takeaways that I've heard over the past couple of days. And I thought this might be useful in particular for people who might have had to come and go from different sessions. So some thoughts for you. First of all, I was struck by how much we stress continuity over change. In particular, this was interesting when we were talking about it in the context of several presidential administrations. An enduring issue that kept coming up was who serves and why, and we kept coming back to that. There was, on one hand, there was this issue about the isolating and empowering aspects of the military being the family business, and then there were the dangers that went with that. There were conversations about the multidimensional importance of getting diversity in the force, but the ongoing challenges of actually making the force more diverse. This transitioned right into the whole issue of talent management, and the talent management needs to include families, both at the beginning of the career and at the end of the career, as military members have different responsibilities that they have to take care of in their personal lives. There was this issue also about fluidity and flexibility, about moving across the active component into the reserve component and back. And there seemed to be a sense that this was important to have this flexibility. But once again, a bit of puzzlement over how we actually pursue this. One very interesting point that came up that we didn't have a chance to tease out is the whole issue of, are we paying enough attention to what is going on in the junior ranks? And if we talk about the apolitical nature of the military and we talk about the importance of cohesion, are we focusing on too many other things and not focusing enough on what's happening in the junior ranks? One point that kept coming up that was almost foundational at several different points in the conference, panelists said, remember, the DoD is huge. And even from a US perspective, and don't even begin to try to imagine it from other nations' perspective, and it is not super agile in handling things, especially the problems of the magnitude that we were just talking about. Another big theme that came up was this connection to the American public. And I think it was in the second panel yesterday where a very interesting conversation occurred over the impact of the demise of the local news, especially the print news, and how that was one of those little appreciated but incredibly important connections between the civil and the military populations. And there was also an ongoing conversation in several of the panels. It was a question that we didn't get to, and it could be a great conversation for a future conference, which is, to what extent is understanding the military, in fact, a civic responsibility? Next big theme that came out, the need to stress the civilian and civ-mil relations versus the military. We talked yesterday about the importance of just getting people in place and how hard that is when it comes to political appointees. The importance of, if you want a trusted military, the best way to build trust is in fact to have a trusted government. And it undermines both if somehow the military is trusted more than other aspects of government. And then there is this need for civilian leadership to actually set limits about what you're going to use the military for and why. We broached that issue. We didn't go into it. Once again, another great issue for follow-up conversation. Today, as we were talking about at the senior levels, the question that kept coming up in my mind, and in fact was one of the ones I asked, is, who is a civilian? I think of myself as a civilian, but as I listen to these conversations, I'm like, I'm a retired one-star. Maybe I'll never be a civilian. So how do we think about who is a civilian, where they should serve especially in places like OSD, and why should they serve there or why should they not? Very interesting comment about the dangers of running the Pentagon like a COCOM. Once again, another interesting statement to unpack. Is that really bad? Why? What does that actually mean? Does it mean that you're operationalizing, or you're being more agile, or you're going down a lane that you shouldn't go down? There was a very robust conversation about the principal agent issue that got wrapped up in all of this. If you don't have political appointees in place, then who is actually the responsible agent that is acting on behalf of the president? Very, very important conversation there. As well was the reminder of of the importance of norms. Not everything has to be stated or legalistic. The importance of understanding the traditional norms and abiding by those for civil military relations, healthy civil military relations. And finally, there was, I think it was in the last panel, this terrific conversation about narrowing the knowledge gap, and that one of the ways that you really enhance everybody when it comes to the civil military relations conversation is to do everything that you can, whether you wear a suit or you wear a uniform, to narrow that knowledge gap and make, once again, going back to yesterday's panel, try to make everybody better, try to lift all the boats with the rising tide. This last panel was a terrific place to end on, and also raised all sorts of interesting questions. There is a huge lexicon issue that I kept thinking of as I was listening to this last panel, which is, what is a military responsibility? Why is this cyber conversation even occurring in the military if we have such a difficult time getting the right people? And so I found myself flipping yesterday's conversations on its head, and where once I was thinking things are very clearly civil and military, this conversation that we ended on had the lines so blurred between the civilian and the military that at times it made me think that our lexicon just doesn't work for the problems that we're dealing with today. And that was a vexing and fascinating place to end the conference on. Huge thanks to all of the panelists, to all of the moderators, especially to the student organizers, Mackenzie, Gia, Corey, Eric. Just a terrific job all the way around. And what I'd like to do at this point is say thanks to all of you for attending, for staying with us. And Gia, I want to turn it back over to you and to Corey to close things out.
Thanks, Dr. Thornhill, and thanks to all of our attendees for participating in this year's conference on civil military relations and for sticking around until the end. We have a couple of thank yous to give out. First, we'd like to thank our fantastic speakers and moderators who have all given us a lot to think about. They've been so generous with their time and expertise, and we greatly appreciate it. We could not have done this without them. In addition to our speakers, we want to thank Dean Elliott Cohen for his welcoming remarks, Doctors Paula Thornhill and Peter Fever for their mentorship and guidance, as well as Stephanie Papa, Thayer McKell, and Melanie Benson, and the SICE Events Communications and IT teams. And now I'm going to hand it over to Corey, who is also on the planning team, to close us out.
Thanks, Gia. As we've seen in the conference sessions yesterday and today, American civilians ask a great deal of their military, and the military has a high expectation of its civilian overseers. We hope this conference underscores the importance of mutual understanding and contributed to building trust between civilians and military. As a military officer myself, I would like to stress the fact that these conversations are necessary, and one of the reasons that military students attend institutions like Duke and Johns Hopkins is to work with their civilian counterparts and have those conversations to have a better understanding. I myself have spent the last 11 years in uniform, straight up undergrad, and therefore I don't have a good understanding of the civilian perspective of a lot of things. So I encourage you to have these conversations with the military personnel, and military personnel to have these conversations with the civilians in their classes, and continue to learn and develop yourself throughout your time in these educational institutions. We hope you enjoyed the conference, and we hope you continue these conversations as I just stated. 50 personnel were selected from the consortium schools to receive a book package. They've received an email with information about those books coming out, and they'll be mailed to your address. And then finally, I'd like to say thank you for attending, and I hope you all have a good night.